welcome to your personalized deep dive into QBQ. It looks like you've been diving deep into the world of personal development, specifically a concept called QBQ. And you sent us a stack of resources all in Chinese about it, so we're here to help you unpack the key takeaways. And for our listeners who are unfamiliar with QBQ, it stands for Question Behind the Question. And it's this really intriguing premise. Imagine if just changing the way you ask questions could actually unlock like a whole new level of effectiveness in your life. And what's really cool about the resources you sent is that they're not just theory. They're packed with tools and techniques to actually put QBQ into practice.
Yeah, it's a powerful idea, isn't it? Like QBQ, or question behind the question. It really encourages us to shift from this like reactive thinking to proactive thinking. And your sources offer some pretty compelling tools to actually help us put this into practice.
So instead of asking like, why is this happening to me? We're encouraged to ask, what can I do about it? I'll admit at first glance, it sounds a little bit like Positive Thinking 101, but I'm curious to see where this goes.
It's definitely more than just positive thinking. QBQ is about taking ownership and focusing on what you can control. It's a framework for approaching challenges and then making more empowered choices.
Okay, I'm intrigued. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give us a little more context? Like, what are the foundational principles behind this QBQ approach?
Yeah, so your sources outline 5 key principles that actually all work together: learning, responsibility, creativity, service, and trust. And they're all interconnected, and they kind of create this blueprint for personal and professional growth.
5 principles. Got it. Let's start with learning. I'm all for continuous learning. But how does that tie into this whole like asking better questions thing?
So think of it this way. Every challenge, every setback can be a learning opportunity. So instead of asking, why is this happening to me? A QBQ approach would be to ask, what can I learn from this situation?
That's a subtle shift. But I see how it like changes the whole framework. Instead of feeling like a victim, you're actually looking for the lesson. You're looking for the takeaway. It's almost like you're turning a negative into a positive.
Exactly. And that's actually where the principle of responsibility comes in. It's about recognizing that we have the power to actually influence our circumstances, rather than just blaming external factors.
So instead of, whose fault is this? It's, what role did I play and what can I do to make things better? I'm sensing a theme here.
Yeah, you're catching on. QBQ is all about taking ownership and focusing on your sphere of influence.
Okay, learning and responsibility check. Now, what about creativity? That one seems a bit more abstract. How does that fit into this whole framework?
So think of creativity as like the problem-solving engine of QBQ. When you hit a roadblock instead of getting stuck, QBQ encourages you to ask, what are some out-of-the-box solutions? It's about embracing possibilities and challenging those assumptions.
I see. So instead of saying, this will never work, you ask, how can I make this work? It's like you're forcing your brain to find a workaround.
That's a great way to put it. And that leads us to the principle of service. It might seem a bit unexpected in a personal development framework, but it's a crucial part of QBQ.
Okay, I'm curious. How does service fit into this whole like asking better questions thing? It sounds a little bit more, well, altruistic.
Right. QBQ isn't just about self-improvement. It's also about recognizing that our actions impact others. So when we're facing a challenge, instead of just asking what's best for me, we can also consider, how can I contribute to a positive outcome for everyone involved?
Though it's about finding solutions that benefit the greater good, not just your own immediate needs. That adds a whole new dimension to the concept. But it also seems like it could be tricky to balance, right?
It definitely requires a conscious effort, and that's where the principle of trust comes in. QBQ is really built on this idea that when we ask better questions, we're demonstrating a commitment to personal growth and accountability.
So by consistently making an effort to improve ourselves and our actions, we build trust with the people around us. It's like walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And that foundation of trust actually makes it easier to implement QBQ, both personally and professionally. It creates a more collaborative and supportive environment.
Okay, 5 principles, all intertwined. I'm starting to see the bigger picture here, but I have to admit, I'm still a little fuzzy on how to actually put this into practice. It's all well and good to talk about principles, but how do I actually start asking those better questions?
That's a great question, and your sources actually provide a whole toolkit to help you do just that. It's actually quite practical and actionable.
Right, now we're talking tools, techniques. I'm ready to dive in. Let's get specific. What kind of tools are we talking about?
Okay, so they range from structured approaches like journaling and action lists to more creative tools like mind maps and even role-playing. There's something for every learning style.
A whole QBQ toolbox. This is getting more and more interesting by the minute. Let's take a closer look at each of these tools. I'm especially curious about the QBQ journal. How does that work?
Yeah, the QBQ journal is a powerful tool for self-reflection and for tracking your progress. It encourages you to write down your initial questions and then using the QBQ principles to transform them into more empowering and action-oriented ones.
I love that. It's like holding up a mirror to your thought patterns and then like actively choosing to reframe them. It's a very deliberate approach to personal growth, isn't it?
It is, and it ties directly back to the principle of learning. By tracking your questions over time, you can really see how your thinking evolves, and you can identify areas where you might still be getting stuck in those reactive patterns.
So the QBQ journal helps you become more aware of your own thought processes and then make conscious choices about how you frame your questions. That's a really insightful way to approach personal development. What other tools did your sources highlight?
So they also mention QBQ discussion groups as a valuable resource. These groups provide a supportive environment where you can share your QBQ journey with others and get feedback and learn from their experiences.
Ah, the power of community. I imagine it's incredibly helpful to connect with others who are also working on asking better questions. It's like having a support system for your personal growth.
Exactly. And it ties directly to the principle of trust, creating a space where people feel safe to be vulnerable and share their challenges and successes.
So you've got the QBQ journal for personal reflection and discussion groups for community support. What other tools did your sources recommend?
Okay, so they also mention QBQ cards, which are a bit like flashcards for better questions. They offer a quick and easy way to remind yourself of the QBQ principles and to kind of prompt you to shift your thinking when you're feeling stuck or challenged.
It's like having a little pocket-sized coach
Yeah,
to help you stay on track.
I could see that being really useful for those moments when you're feeling overwhelmed or frustrated. Absolutely. And they're especially helpful for people who are new to QBQ or who are struggling to apply the principles consistently.
Okay, so we've got tools for self-reflection, community support, and quick reminders. This is a pretty impressive toolkit already. What else is in there?
So your sources also highlight the QBQ action list. As a crucial tool for turning those better questions into concrete steps, it encourages you to break down your goals into manageable actions and to track your progress.
Ah, so it's about moving from intention to action. It's one thing to ask the right questions, but it's another thing entirely to actually do something with those insights.
Exactly. And this tool connects directly to the principle of responsibility. It's about taking ownership of your goals and making a conscious effort to move forward.
The QBQ action list. I'm adding that to my personal development toolkit for sure. Are there any other tools we should know about?
Yeah, they also mentioned two more that are visually oriented, mind maps and role-playing.
Ooh, visual tools. I'm a visual learner, so I'm all ears. How do those work in the context of QBQ?
Okay, so mind maps. They can be a really powerful way to brainstorm solutions and to see the bigger picture. You start with a central question or challenge, and then branch out to explore different facets of the problem, potential solutions, and action steps. It's a way to visually organize your thoughts and make connections that you might not have seen otherwise.
I love that. I use mind maps for all sorts of things, but I never thought to apply them to like personal development. It's such a great way to get unstuck and to see new possibilities. What about role playing? That one seems a bit more out there.
Yeah, so role-playing is a more interactive tool. It encourages you to step outside of your own perspective and to see a situation through someone else's eyes.
Okay, that's interesting. But how does that relate to asking better questions?
So imagine you're facing a conflict with a coworker. By role-playing the situation from their perspective, you might gain a better understanding of their motivations, their challenges, and their point of view. And this in turn can help you formulate more insightful and empathetic questions.
So instead of getting stuck in your own assumptions and judgments, you're actively seeking to understand the other person's experience. That's a really powerful way to shift your perspective. I'm really starting to see how these tools can work together to create a more holistic and effective approach to QBQ.
Exactly. And they all tie back to those 5 core principles we discussed earlier: learning, responsibility, creativity, service, and trust.
This has been such a fascinating exploration so far, but we've mainly focused on the personal development applications of QBQ, and your sources also mentioned its relevance in the workplace. And I'd love to delve into that a bit further.
Absolutely. Your sources dive into how leaders can cultivate a QBQ culture within their teams. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels empowered to ask those better questions and work together to find solutions.
Okay, now we're really talking. Most of us spend a significant portion of our lives at work, so I'm really curious to hear how this plays out in a professional setting. What steps can leaders take to foster this QBQ culture?
It all starts with introducing the concept in a way that resonates with the team. Leaders need to explain QBQ in a clear and engaging way, using real-life examples that illustrate its value.
So it's not just about giving a PowerPoint presentation on the principles. It's about bringing it to life, making it relatable, showing how it can actually benefit people in their day-to-day work.
Exactly, and it's about going beyond just explaining the concept. Leaders need to provide training and resources to help their team members really grasp the principles and put them into practice.
So workshops, coaching sessions, maybe even sharing some of those QBQ tools we talked about earlier.
Yes, exactly. And don't forget the importance of leading by example. When leaders embody the QBQ mindset themselves, it sends a powerful message to their team, and it inspires others to follow suit.
Actions speak louder than words, right? But let's be realistic. Shifting an entire team's way of thinking, especially in a workplace setting, can be a daunting task. Did your sources address any potential obstacles or challenges?
They did. And that's something we can explore in more detail after a quick break. We'll be back in a flash to tackle those challenges head on.
All right, we're back and ready to tackle those workplace challenges you mentioned. Implementing QBQ in a team setting sounds great in theory, but I imagine it's not always smooth sailing.
Yeah, you're right. It takes a conscious effort, and there will likely be bumps along the road. Your sources highlighted a few common challenges leaders might encounter.
Let's hear them. All ears. What kind of obstacles are we talking about?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is resistance to change. People can be very comfortable with the status quo, even if it's not ideal.
I can definitely relate to that. It's human nature to resist the unknown, even if it could be better for us. So how can leaders overcome that resistance and get their team on board with this QBQ approach?
Patience and clear communication are key. Instead of forcing the concept on their team, leaders need to highlight the benefits of QBQ and address any concerns head on.
So it's about showing people how QBQ can actually make their lives better, not just adding another task to their already overflowing to-do lists.
Precisely. For example, a leader could explain how QBQ can help reduce stress by encouraging proactive problem solving instead of dwelling on things they can't control.
That makes sense. It's about framing QBQ as a tool for empowerment, not just another corporate initiative. What other challenges did your sources mention?
Another common obstacle is the ever-present issue of time constraints. People are already juggling so many responsibilities. The thought of adding another layer can feel overwhelming.
I hear that. Time is a precious commodity these days. So how do you make QBQ work when everyone is already stretched thin?
The key is integration. Instead of treating QBQ as a separate task, find ways to weave it into existing workflows.
Give me an example. How would that work in practice?
For instance, encourage teams to take a few minutes at the start of meetings to reflect on the questions they want to ask. By framing their questions through the QBQ lens, they'll be more likely to have a productive and solution-oriented discussion.
That's a really smart approach. You're not adding more to their plate. You're simply making the existing processes more effective. I like that. Any other challenges we should be aware of?
The last one your sources highlighted is uncertainty. People might understand the concept of QBQ, but feel unsure about how to actually apply it in specific situations.
I can see that. It can be intimidating to try something new, especially when you don't have a clear roadmap. What's the antidote to that uncertainty? How can leaders help their team feel more confident about using QBQ?
Providing clear examples and case studies can be incredibly helpful. When people see how others have successfully used QBQ to overcome challenges and achieve positive outcomes, it can be incredibly motivating and inspiring.
So it's about showing, not just telling. Instead of saying QBQ works, you're giving them concrete examples of how it's worked for others. That's much more compelling.
Exactly. And it ties back to the principle of learning. People learn best through observation and experience. So providing those real-life examples can be a powerful way to build confidence and clarity.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential challenges of implementing QBQ in the workplace and some strategies for overcoming them. I'm really starting to see how QBQ could be a game changer for teams and organizations. But let's shift gears for a moment. We've talked a lot about the what and the why of QBQ, but I think our listeners are probably itching to hear more about the how.
You're right. It's time to delve into the art of crafting those powerful QBQs.
That's what I'm talking about. Let's get down to brass tacks. How do we actually formulate those better questions that can shift our thinking and lead to positive change?
It's a bit like learning a new language. At first, it might feel a bit awkward and unfamiliar, but with practice, it becomes more natural and intuitive. Your sources highlight a few key guidelines for constructing those powerful QBQs.
Okay, I'm ready to take notes. Lay it on us. What are the grammar rules, so to speak, of this QBQ language?
Well, the first rule is simple. Start with what or how.
Interesting. Why those two words in particular?
Starting your questions with what or how immediately focuses your mind on solutions and actions. It's about proactively seeking ways to improve a situation.
I see. And I guess starting with why often leads down a rabbit hole of justifications. Blame and excuses, right?
Got it. So instead of asking, why is this project failing, a QBQ approach would be, what can I do to contribute to its success?
That's a great example. Just changing that one word completely reframes the question.
Yeah.
And shifts your focus from complaining to problem solving. What other guidelines did your sources mention?
Another crucial element is to focus on what you can control. QBQs should be about what you can do, not what others should do or how circumstances should be different.
So instead of asking, why isn't my team more motivated? A better QBQ would be, how can I inspire and motivate my team members?
Exactly. It's about taking ownership of your sphere of influence and focusing on the things you can actually change.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. QBQs are action-oriented,
Yeah.
solution-focused, and empowering. Are there any other guidelines we should keep in mind?
The last one your sources emphasized is to keep your QBQs positive and constructive. Avoid questions that are negative, accusatory, or defeatist.
Or instead of, what's the point of even trying?
Hmm.
A QBQ-driven question would be, what small step can I take right now to move forward?
You nailed it. It's about maintaining a positive and proactive mindset, even in the face of challenges.
I'm really digging this QBQ approach. I can see how simply changing the way I ask questions could have a ripple effect on my thinking and my actions. But let's get even more specific. Can you give us some real-life examples of QBQs that we can use in different situations?
Of course. So let's say you're feeling overwhelmed by a heavy workload. Instead of asking, why do I have so much to do? A QBQ could be, what tasks are most important and how can I prioritize them effectively?
That's a great one. It shifts the focus from feeling victimized by your workload to taking control and finding a solution. What about if you're facing a setback or a failure? Those can be tough to deal with.
Right. So instead of asking, why did this happen to me? A better QBQ might be, what can I learn from this experience and apply moving forward?
So it's about reframing failure as a learning opportunity. That's a much more empowering perspective. What about if you're feeling stuck or uninspired?
Instead of asking, why am I so unmotivated?
Yeah.
A QBQ could be, what steps can I take to reignite my passion and purpose?
These examples are incredibly helpful. It's amazing how a simple shift in wording can completely change your perspective on a situation. But before we wrap things up, I want to touch on one more thing that came up earlier. We were talking about how QBQ can be applied in the workplace. And you mentioned that leaders play a crucial role in fostering a QBQ culture. But is there a risk that this could feel forced or inauthentic? How can leaders encourage this shift in thinking without coming across as preachy or manipulative?
That's a really insightful question. It's definitely important for leaders to be mindful of how they introduce and implement QBQ. Instead of dictating how their team should think, it's about creating an environment where people feel safe to experiment with this new approach and discover its benefits for themselves.
So it's about leading by example, providing support and resources, and allowing the team to embrace QBQ organically.
Exactly. And that's something we can dive into in more detail in our final segment.
All right, we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into QBQ. We've covered a lot of ground, from the foundational principles to practical tools, and even the challenges of implementing QBQ in the workplace. But I think it'd be helpful to circle back to that idea of fostering a QBQ culture. It sounds great in theory, but how can leaders actually make it happen without it feeling forced or inauthentic?
Yeah, it's a delicate balance for sure. You want to encourage the adoption of QBQ without making it feel like a top-down mandate.
So it's more about creating an environment where QBQ can flourish organically.
Exactly. It starts with leading by example. Leaders who genuinely embody the QBQ mindset in their own actions and communication will inspire others to do the same.
It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk, right?
Precisely. And it's about going beyond just modeling the behavior. Leaders need to actively cultivate a culture of curiosity and open communication, where people feel comfortable asking those better questions.
So it's about creating a safe space for people to experiment with QBQ and discover its benefits for themselves.
Exactly. And that might involve providing specific training and resources on QBQ, incorporating it into team meetings and discussions, or even recognizing and rewarding team members who demonstrate the QBQ mindset.
I like that. It's about weaving QBQ into the fabric of the workplace culture,
Hmm.
not just treating it as a separate initiative. But wouldn't it be helpful to give people some more concrete guidance on how to actually formulate those better questions? I mean, we've talked about starting with what or how and focusing on things within your control. But are there any other tips or tricks that leaders can share with their team?
Absolutely. One technique that your sources highlight is what they call the flip it technique.
Flip it. That sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
Okay, so it's a simple but powerful way to transform a reactive question into a proactive QBQ. So let's say a team member is feeling frustrated about a lack of resources for a project. Their initial question might be, why don't we have the resources we need?
A classic why question,
Yeah.
often leading to blame and frustration.
Exactly. So using the flip it technique, you would flip the focus from the problem to the solution. The question then becomes, what resources do we have and how can we utilize them most effectively?
I see. You're flipping the question from a complaint to a challenge, from a focus on what's missing to a focus on what's possible. That's a brilliant strategy.
It is, and it's a technique that anyone can use in any situation. It encourages you to take ownership, think creatively, and find solutions, even when you're faced with limitations.
I'm already starting to see how QBQ can be a game changer for teams and organizations. But I also imagine that it's a journey, not a destination. It's about constantly striving to ask those better questions, even when it feels challenging.
Absolutely. And that's where the principle of learning really comes into play. It's about embracing the process of growth and recognizing that there will be times when we fall back into those old patterns of thinking.
So it's about being kind to ourselves when we stumble, but also having the awareness to catch ourselves
Hmm.
and redirect our thinking.
Exactly. And that's something that leaders can encourage within their teams, a culture of continuous learning and improvement, where it's okay to make mistakes as long as we're learning from them.
That's such a powerful message. I think this deep dive has given our listener a lot to think about and hopefully a lot to get excited about. Asking better questions, as we've discovered, can truly transform your approach to challenges and opportunities, both personally and professionally.
It's a journey well worth taking.
It certainly is. But we haven't talked specifically about the process of coming up with those better questions. What techniques or strategies do you think might be helpful in crafting those powerful QBQs?
That's a great question to leave our listener with. It encourages them to continue exploring and personalizing their QBQ practice.
Absolutely. Every question is an opportunity for growth and discovery. So keep asking those better questions and watch as your world transforms. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into QBQ.